Good morning, Faith Community. Now, I'm going to share with you a story this morning of the children of Israel. Now, as they were making their way to the promised land during the wilderness wanderings, God provided for them every single day manna from heaven. All of their needs were provided for. He would give them a double portion on Fridays so they would have enough on the Sabbath so that they could rest. But eventually, the children of Israel got tired of what God was providing. They started complaining and they said, "We want meat." And so what God did is he gave them what they thought they wanted. He gave them pigeons. So much pigeon meat, it said it came out their nose. And as they were eating it, they got diseases and they started to die. God sent them this because they thought that was what they wanted. I want you to think about what we've been experiencing for the last 3 months as we've had to go to online streaming church. Maybe in the past you've felt like, I sure wish I could turn down the volume on the preacher. I sure wish I could fast forward through this part. It's sort of boring. I sure wish I could skip this song, or I wish I didn't have to get dressed up and go to church, or I wish I didn't have to leave and go to church. I wish I could just stay home and start church whenever I wanted. Well, all of those wishes now have become a reality because with online church, you can do all those things. But I think once it starts coming out our nose, we realize this isn't what I want. I want to be in the assembly. Well, when you read the Psalms, you hear David oftentimes talking about his longing to go up into the house of the Lord, to be assembled together with the saints. This is the longing of every believer's heart, to be assembled together. I've been sharing with you this week from Hebrews 10, verses 24 and following. Let me read to you again from Hebrews 10:24. "And let us watch out for one another to provoke love and good works, not neglecting to gather together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging each other, and all the more as you see the day approaching." Yesterday, I talked about the importance of gathering together. And what I want to focus on today is why. Why are we supposed to gather together? Well, he tells us right here. Why do we gather together? So that we can encourage each other. So he says, don't neglect to gather together, but instead encourage one another. So he's showing us that the purpose of our gathering is so that we can encourage each other. So what's so encouraging about assembling together? Well, several things. The first thing comes from Matthew 18. In Matthew 18, verse 19 and 20, Jesus says this. He says, "Again, truly I tell you, if two of you on earth agree about any matter that you pray for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered together in my name, I am there among them." Now I want you to understand this. Jesus is saying when we gather together in his name, he is there among us. Now I want you to understand this. Jesus isn't far from us when we're by ourselves. He said, "I'll never leave you or forsake you." He is always listening. He's always present with us. He's there to help in times of need. But when we assemble together with fellow believers, and it could be in a gathering in a church that's as small as 2 or 3 people, God is there in the midst of them, and specifically hearing their prayers. So what is he saying? He's not saying he doesn't hear our prayers when we pray individually, but he is saying that there is a certain power present when we gather together, when we assemble together. The next passage I want to point out to you is in Acts chapter 2, verse 42. In Acts 2:42, it talks about the early church. They've heard Peter's sermon at Pentecost, and thousands have been saved. And it says this: "They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer." This was the practice of the church from its inception, from its very beginning. What did they do? They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. So they gathered together so they could hear the apostles teach. What do we do today? We gather together so we can hear teachings that's based on what the apostles taught. The New Testament, that's what they wrote to us. We study those things. We assemble so that we can hear the teaching. But what else? It's not just teaching that they dedicate themselves to, fellowship. We gather together to fellowship, and that's specifically what Hebrews 10 is talking about. We don't want to forsake the assembling of ourselves together, but we want to encourage each other. That's what's happening in fellowship. And also to the breaking of bread. That means specifically breaking of bread is communion. It's gathering together for communion. The church is meant to gather together to assemble for communion. That's why we do that every quarter at our church. And to prayer. Every time the church assembles, we pray together. There's power in the unity of the saints in dedicating themselves to prayer together. When all the Spirit-filled believers gather together and they're one heart and one mind and praying together, there's power in those prayers. You can be confident it's not just your individual desires you're expressing when your fellow saints come alongside you and they're praying about the same things. Well, listen to Paul's directions also to the Corinthian church. In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul says this in verse 17. Now, in giving this instruction, I do not praise you, since you come together. You hear that phrase again? You come together not for the better, but for the worse. For to begin with, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. Indeed, it is necessary that there may be factions among you, so that those who are approved may be recognized among you. When you come together, then, it's not to eat the Lord's Supper. What Paul is saying, he's chiding the Corinthians church for being factious in their gathering. What's so special about assembling together is that we are unified when we gather. The church should be marked by unity. Jesus said our unity is what proclaims to the world that Jesus was actually sent from the Father. And not only that, we're unified around something. We're unified around the Lord's Supper. That's why it's called communion, because there's community, there's unity surrounding that meal, because that's what joins us all together. We're all being sustained by his body. We're all cleansed by his blood. That's all of ours. It's for all of us, it's our only hope. Well, I want to jump forward 3 chapters in 1 Corinthians because Paul points out something else that's the purpose of the gathering of the saints. He spends a lot of time in chapter 12 and 13 explaining the perfect purpose of the body and all of its diversity being unified. And then in chapter 14, verse 23, Paul says this: if therefore the whole church assembles together and all are speaking in other tongues and people who are outsiders or unbelievers come in, will they not say that you are out of your minds? Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14, the church at Corinth was failing because they would get together and everybody would be speaking in tongues and nobody would understand anything. And what that meant is they left and they weren't edified. And the reason is because they weren't speaking intelligibly to each other. What Paul does in 1 Corinthians 14, he juxtaposes 2 different types of speech: speaking in tongues and speaking prophetically. Speaking in tongues is speaking so people can't understand you. Speaking prophetically is speaking. He says this, he defines it in verse 3. The person who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouragement, and consolation. In 1 Corinthians 14, Paul's not talking about foretelling the future when he talks about prophecy. He's talking about speaking to each other for their strengthening, encouragement, and consolation. Paul's goal for the Corinthian church was that when they gathered together, instead of everybody speaking in tongues and nobody understanding each other, that they gathered together and they spoke strength, encouragement, and consolation to each other. That's the purpose of the assembly. That's why we gather together, to encourage one another, to strengthen one another, to console one another. We need that. We need each other. let's redeem this time as we're slowly able to gather together. I know we can't be in the full community of saints yet. There's still danger out there that we have to be careful of. We can't open up our whole worship center. But I just want you to encourage you as we do come back together, that you understand what it is we're doing, as it has been denied to us for so long. I am looking forward to seeing you all this Sunday as we assemble together to encourage one another. I'll see you then. Thanks.